Welcome. We're back as the Shark Docs, adding a final episode to our podcast series, Beyond All the Sharks, where we dive deeper into the conservation context for each location we explored on our journey to win Netflix's All the Sharks, bringing $50,000 back to two nonprofits close to our hearts, the Ocean First Institute and the Reef Environmental Education Foundation. Today, we are focused on Japan, a country with incredible marine biodiversity, rich cultural connections to the ocean, and one of the world's largest fishing fleets operating domestically and internationally. Japan, like some of our other sites, sits at the intersection of major ocean currents, creating a mosaic of ecosystems that range from the subtropical coral reefs of Okinawa to the temperate waters near Tokyo, where we were diving. These currents deliver nutrient-rich waters that support a remarkable diversity of sharks and rays. Something like 120 species live in Japan's waters, including some that occur nowhere else, like the banded hound shark, the red stingray, and the ever-elusive Japanese angel shark. But today's conversation is going to be wide-ranging, not limited to Japanese species or waters, and instead we'll focus on shark conservation on the global stage, with an eye on the Western Pacific region as a whole, including Japan, China, and Hong Kong, and how the fate of many sharks may rest in its hands.
We are fortunate to be speaking with Dr. Shelley Clarke. She is a fisheries scientist and one of the world's leading experts on the global shark fin trade, illegal fishing, and catch documentation. Shelley earned her PhD from Imperial College London for groundbreaking research estimating global shark catches from trade data, and has spent the last 30 years based in Eastern Asia. Today, Shelley runs Sasama Consulting in Japan, advising on sustainable fisheries management, shark bycatch, and tuna longline fleets, and the implementation of international conservation agreements, working with the UN, regional fisheries management organizations, RFMOs, and CITES, to name a few. Most recently, she earned the Japan Foreign Minister's Commendation for Sustainable Fisheries in 2024. And we are so honored to welcome Dr. Shelley, fellow Shark Doc, to our podcast today.
Hi, nice to be here.
All right, so let's get started at the beginning, because we read a little bit about you online, whatever we could find, and saw that you grew up around Bar Harbor, Maine, which is actually a special place for me too. I was a junior park ranger at Acadia as a kid.
Oh, lucky you.
Yeah. And then you found yourself on board a Japanese mothership as a fisheries observer. So first off, what is a mothership? That sounds like something out of Star Wars. And what memories really stand out from that experience that shaped your career?
Well, yeah, I grew up actually in Winter Harbor, Maine, which is across the bay from Bar Harbor, so not where all the wealthy people live. And it still is a lobster fishing town. So although my family was not involved in the fishing industry per se, I was very aware of, fishermen and the problems that they face. So I guess, deep down, that sort of inspired me to get into the management side of things. And it took a while as I started majoring in zoology, and that could have taken me in lots of different directions, like being a park ranger myself. But I ended up going back to the marine environment and getting really fascinated by the assemblages on the North Carolina shoreline. And then I applied to the University of Washington to go to the School of Fisheries. And part of the program that was being run out of that university at the time was to send basically students, but you didn't have to be a student, as a summer job up to Alaska to monitor what was happening in the Alaska EEZ with foreign fleets fishing for pollock. Because at that time, the U.S. fleet had not developed its capacity to fish for themselves. Well, they were fishing for themselves, but to process the fish, they brought in this Japanese mothership, which is basically a floating factory processor. And I was stationed on that mothership to monitor what was being caught by 6 American catcher boats fishing around the clock. So my job was to look at all the fish that came on board, pull out all the bycatch, estimate how much bycatch there was, and the total quantity being caught. And I just loved it. It was just one of the best experiences that I ever had. And the funny thing is, when I went into the program, there were basically 2 kinds of assignments you could get. You could be on a Russian ship or you could be on a Japanese ship. And this was Cold War days. I thought, oh, this is going to be fascinating being on a Russian ship. I really want to be on a Russian ship. And then they told me I was going on a Japanese ship, and I was like, no, I don't want to go on a Japanese ship. And it changed my life, because, all this time later, I'm now living in Japan and I've become a Japanese citizen, and I really love so many aspects of Japanese culture.
So how did that happen?
Yeah, well, I got a fellowship to go work in China, and that took me to Asia. And then from there, I went to Hong Kong, and I was working in marine science in Hong Kong. And I decided to go back and do my PhD. So I needed a project, and I was in Hong Kong. So the shark fin trade came to mind, and I ended up doing that as my PhD. And then as a postdoc, I had realized that it wasn't just about shark finning and trade. It was, that fisheries management and stock assessment was where it was at. So I wanted to learn more about stock assessment, and I got a postdoc to go to Japan and learn about stock assessment. This Japanese scientists have the privilege of working with probably the world's best long-term catch record for sharks. Those Japanese fishermen write down everything they catch. So I went to Japan on a 2-year postdoc, and I ended up staying on after that. And that was a long time ago now, and I've become a Japanese citizen. I love living in Japan, and I do as much work with Japanese fisheries as I can. But as we have talked about, the scope of my work is really quite international.
So that speaks to some of the things we were discussing before we started recording, of these sort of like convoluted paths that we all take to get to where we end up going, things that are completely unexpected. That is,
Can't imagine.
can never imagine. I'm also curious to know, from an observer standpoint, did you feel that you were positively received, one, as a female on the boats, and two, by the fishing fleets themselves? Were you welcome there generally, or did you get some opposition to your being on their vessels?
Yeah, that's a good question, because that can really be a problem, and can determine whether your experience is a good one or not. I think the I think the American catcher boats were not that happy that I was out there, but the Japanese ship was the one that was hosting me, and they were really on their best behavior to make sure that they were cooperative and they were friendly to me. So I had a very good experience. And as a woman, they put 2 of us on board, 2 women, and so I had some company out there. And I wouldn't say I had any kind of harassment, but I did. There was one. I think he was the deck manager. He was, always happy to kind of push me aside when I would happen to be in his way. So wasn't particularly, you know, 100% good working environment, but overall it was good.
Yeah, I think we hear all kinds of stories related to how observers are perceived, and that was at the origins of a lot of those programs. But even now, there's really good stories, and then there's also some that are pretty scary and sketchy, and everything in between. So yeah, it's just always interesting to hear people's perception of how they dealt with those things. But it sounds like that was an overall positive experience for you, or you would not be where you are today.
Right. Yeah. And I have to say I was really lucky, because when I got back on shore and compared my experience with other people in my observer training class, I had one of the best experiences. So I don't want to give the impression that it's all like that, but I was very lucky.
And did that experience working with those folks but make you interested in spending time in Japan? Like, was that the introduction to that culture, and did that lead you to living in that part of the world?
Absolutely. Yeah. I just was fascinated with Japanese culture. And I guess, people ask me, how did I really understand what Japanese culture was just being on a Japanese boat? But it so determined. It's a very hierarchical society. So when you transfer that to a boat, everybody has their role, everybody has their place. And it was a very safety conscious environment, and it just ran like clockwork. And I thought, not only is this making my observer job very easy, but I like to be like this. So that was probably the thing that first interested me. And then, we had Japanese food. We were watching Japanese TV in the mess hall. I got a little bit of exposure to Japanese language. And when I went back on shore, I I just was really interested in Japan. And the more I learned, the more interested I got. I started taking Japanese lessons, and I love the language in particular. It's still one of my joys, really, is to improve my Japanese day by day.
And that's probably not an easy feat either. I mean, Japanese language does, I mean, from at least an outside perspective, does not seem like an easy language to understand. But you also were able to just completely indulge in the culture on the boat, coming back to Japan, which is Brendan and I think that was one of the things that struck us the most when we were visiting Japan is, and from our Japanese colleagues, just like there's a culture there that is different than most. And I think you hit it the nail on the head with the way that they're organized and structured. It's a very disciplined culture and something that if you have an organized brain, it's especially like you can feed into that very well. But it was a really cool experience for us to be there and to see that even in a small amount.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, the language is very challenging, but I actually went to Asia. I wanted to go to Japan and work, but I wanted to work as a fishery scientist. And at that early stage in my career, that just didn't seem possible. So I just kept going in fisheries and environmental science, actually, in the US for several years. And then I found out about this fellowship from the Henry Luce Foundation that sends people to Asia, sends 18 people every year to Asia for an immersive internship. And I thought, wow, that'd be great. I could get that and go to Japan. So I applied and I got it. And I was so excited. And they said, you're going to China. So I had to spend the summer in like a Chinese language boot camp learning Chinese. And it just about killed me. We had to learn 30 Chinese characters, new characters every day. But that got me over the hump because the Chinese characters are used in the Japanese language, more or less. There's a little bit of a difference. But because I had that immersion in Chinese, when I came back to Japanese eventually, that, it became a lot easier for me than for a lot of other foreigners because I sort of knew what I was looking for when I was reading them.
The one thing about this cultural shift that it sounds like you experienced is the relationship to seafood. I mean, it sounds like in your case, you were familiar with seafood and fisheries from a very early age, starting in Maine. But, for most people in the US, fish are often just at the grocery store. And it felt like in our brief time in Japan, and, from what little we're familiar with from that part of the world, it's very different. Like seafood is it's not eaten once a week or once a month. It's like every day or multiple times a day. It just has a much greater meaning than in US culture. So how did moving there shift your perspective on the oceans and marine life and the relationship between all of that and people?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I mean, the average Japanese person knows so much more about seafood than the average American. And they know the different species that things come from. And they have access in the media to things like the stock status. For example, there's something called Pacific Sori or Sanma in Japanese that everybody's constantly coming up to me and saying, oh, yeah, the Sanma's doing well this year. And you'd never have a conversation like that in the West. No, I don't think. So it's really gratifying. I knew this before I got there, but actually I've found it in my daily life to live in a society where people actually think that what you're doing is really important to them on a personal basis. So I've had experiences in other places where I tell people what I do and they're like, does that have something to do with fish? I'm like, yes, it does. Like let's go back to the most basic aspect of it. But and to have somebody come up and say, oh, isn't it great that this stock is recovering? Or I saw on the news that Pacific bluefin tuna is, going to be having a cut in its quota. What does that mean for availability in the store? That kind of thing. So yeah, it's great.
That's wild. Yeah, I feel like here, even like since this show has come out, we're doing more public facing work. We're giving more talks at places. People suddenly want us to say things, um, which is funny. Like after we've spent a lot of time in this career doing all kinds of stuff, but then a show comes out and that's what people want. Then they want to hear from you. It's not when you publish a paper or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, all that aside, yeah, I think when we give some of these talks, it's like you have to find a way to connect oceans to people, which is such a funny thing to put effort into trying to do when it's so obvious. There are so many connections all the time. So it must be so nice to be in a place where you don't have to like market the connections to the ocean. It's just an understanding, a foundational understanding and hits people every day.
Yeah, you can just skip those preliminary steps and just get straight to the heart of the conversation. But I wanted to tell you about like a media personality that we have in Japan that I don't know if you've heard about. Is called Sakana-kun. Sakana means fish in Japanese, and kun is like san, but we're a junior guy, so it's kind of like fish guy. But he's always been interested in fish. Like when he was a high school student, he was like an illustrator drawing fish and doing his own, citizen science research on fish. And now he's about 50 years old, but he's been in the media spotlight for decades now, just talking about fish and just being interested in fish. And now he's even like a conservation spokesman. He's testifies at the diet, and he's on different TV shows. I don't know if he has his own TV show. There's been a movie made about his life, and everybody knows him. And he's constantly bringing these stories to people, more from a kind of isn't this crazy about fish biology sort of perspective than conservation per se. But still, I mean, just to have a character like that in the media does a lot about what people are interested in.
That's very interesting. I don't talk about this often, but I not because I don't have a platform to. During my PhD work, I worked a lot on Goliath grouper, this big reef fish grouper in the Western Atlantic. And I had two independent Japanese film crews come to film, and it was just like it was this crazy sort of concept. They had a host, and then they filmed Goliath grouper diving on the deck of the boat, and they were very interested in the biology of it. But when it came to the actual production of it, very hard to find in mainstream media. But what they ended up producing, the end of it was some sort of like a game show where there was a bunch of contestants. I think they all had different experiences, and they were like competing with each other. And of course, I don't know. You know what? I'm going to send this to you later because I have a YouTube video because I want you to interpret it and I want to understand it better. I've never truly understood what they were trying to accomplish with this, because they have like a monkey going down a chain. Every time somebody has experience, they show part of a clip, and then the monkey moves around with bananas. I never.
Oh, Chris?
Yes.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Yes.
この人物こそがゴライアスグルーパー調査チームのリーダークリス・マリノウスキーさん。
So all the sharks wasn't your first dose of reality TV.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
I was expecting to come to Japan and for everybody to recognize me from my debut back in like 2014 on these two documentaries we did. Anyway.
Well, and also that Japan was making a game show out of fish, which is, kind of what led to all the sharks, right?
That's right.
They were
the first ones, early adopters.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, it was just interesting to see what was popular in TV at the time. I'm assuming that had something to do with the culture that I didn't understand, and I was always intrigued by what they produced. But anyway, I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah, well, and even in the arts, you see fish in old woodblock prints and, as designs of textiles and things. So it's just, it's everywhere.
For sure. Go ahead, Brendan.
Real quick before we move to the next topic, I'm curious, about in Japan, what is the balance? Like, seafood's so important. So is conservation at the forefront of people's minds about all this because there's such a practical end result of conserving and having healthy stocks, or is it like purely exploitation mindset for a lot of people, like the general public?
I would say, it's very people-centered kind of philosophy in Asia in general, not just Japan. So it's a lot about how much can we catch and how much is in the supermarkets. But I don't know that that's so deeply ingrained that if we didn't have more conservation messages on TV, if we did have more conservation messages on TV, then people would pick that up. But I think the media just doesn't highlight those aspects of the story. So people are always very interested to talk to me because I'm telling them that, and they're like, "Oh wow, that's so interesting. I didn't know that's why the Pacific bluefin tuna quota has to be cut." Or other aspects of like environmental influence on the Pacific sour population. Climate change is causing the fishing grounds to move outside of the Japanese EEZ, etc. So yeah, I think if we could. Of course, there are Japanese NGOs that are working on getting these messages out there, but if that could be amplified a bit more, I think generally that consciousness in society would grow, but it's just not there at the moment.
Gotcha. Thank you.
I've just been so amazed in Japan, but also when I visited like Indonesia and Malaysia, that how the level of seafood that exists in some of these markets and how we still have anything in our ocean is just beyond me. It's been eye-opening to see some of these markets and how the diversity of seafood well beyond what we consume in the States, but also just the sheer amount that gets consumed. It's either the ocean is more sustainable than we know, or things are just being fished down and maybe they're being managed better now. But that's been an observation that I've just never been able to like erase from my brain of how much is consumed. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that from your experience.
Yeah, that is the biggest mystery in my mind about sharks. You know, back in the early 2000s when I was just starting to work on this, there was, I guess, in my mind, and probably in the minds of many people who are sort of waking up to this issue, the exploitation rates were so high and the reproductive capacity so low in sharks that we just thought we were looking at an imminent, population crash across many species. But yet, the catch rates are still really high for a lot of these species. So, okay, there's effort creep, and that's a term we use to say that, like technology is getting better, our ability to find where the fish are is getting better. So we're fishing harder, basically, and that's why we're maintaining the catch rates. But still, there has to be some either pockets where these sharks are protected from fisheries, or their reproductive rates are more resilient and can respond to produce more sharks if they're being fished harder. I think somewhere along the line, our assumptions about the productivity of sharks is off because, we should have seen more species crashing. I mean, there are some where we don't find hardly any anymore, like oceanic white-tip. But some of the other sharks are doing okay. Their populations are fished down, but year after year, those catch rates are maintained. And I'm just asking at this point, in the 2020s, how can that be?
And maybe we can get more, well, I know we want to get more into some of the data and how that's understood in some later questions, because I think that really speaks to how we understand the data, especially from some of the fisheries that it's really hard to get data from, right? And the uncertainty surrounding that. Brendan, unless you have another question, I wanted to segue into the next thing. So food is a very much Japanese-centric part of the culture. We understand that. But then beyond that, we have, the show that we were on was all about diving and seeing them in the water and, in their environment. And we know that Japan hosts such an array of sharks and rays, yet it doesn't seem like they've really caught up to the rest of the world in terms of tourism and diving with sharks, even though there's a lot of opportunities to do that there. Do you have any insight into why that might be and has that maybe like shifted over time in your?
The water's cold. That's
Well,
the first thing that occurs to me.
agree.
But yeah. Well, and watching your experience on the episode in Japan, I mean, the conditions are kind of tricky sometimes. So I don't think it's a beginner dive. It's not maybe as, beginner friendly as some of the other places that people could go if they wanted to have a, initial, what do they call it, resort dive course or something. But yeah, I think in recent years, diving has continued to grow as a hobby in Japan. But I did a little bit of background on this to talk to you before we came on this show. But it seems like it's dropped off in recent years. Yet the dive operators are still growing their businesses because there's such a huge tourist boom in Japan right now. So it's foreign tourists that are coming to dive in Japan. That's what my internet research told me. I wonder if you saw that when you were in Japan too, and talking to the dive operators that you were diving with.
I don't know that we got a complete sense of how they normally operate because we were kind of in our own little cushioned environment for this. I know, when we dived, say, in like Shark City, the Sharknado famous site near Tokyo, that was a much more touristy sort of dive, and it seemed to be a lot of people that were in and out of that operation. That was the major one that we saw. And, I think the experience with that is that's kind of a unique place and way that they've set up ecotourism around, at a local level to prevent bycatch and depredation is the history of that site. So I don't know, do you have any insight into maybe that site in particular? And so, how that's sort of developed and whether or not that might be an example for other dive operations in around Japan.
Yeah, I don't know much about that site in particular, but I know that it's near Tokyo, so that's kind of convenient for a lot of people to get to. A lot of places in Japan are, you know, harder to get to. The conditions are more dangerous, and I just have this sense that, I mean, I live way out away from the city in Japan, and I have people come out and visit me, and they're just afraid of animals. Like, do you have bear around here? We're having a lot of bear attacks in Japan at the moment. Oh, and but even like deer, mountain goats, wild boar, they're just like animals. It's not something like that you want to see. It's something that you're afraid of. So maybe there's that, especially with sharks, that kind of fear factor that keeps people from wanting to get too close to them.
Interesting. So maybe because there's more of like a food centric culture there, there's less of a wildlife encounter desire for maybe part of the culture. I mean, I guess maybe we see that in the States to some extent, right? People that are in the city don't necessarily experience, you know, or try to push themselves to go into nature, say into parks to see wildlife or go on dives. It's definitely a specific community that doesn't. It's not everybody. So I wonder if that's kind of the same thing in Japan to some extent, where their interaction with you know I guess sharks and rays in this case is through consumption rather than through that. Because I mean, certainly there's a lot of really good dives there, right? With scalloped hammerheads in particular, and Bikamoto, and some of these areas that you could just jump in the water. They're there. The Sharknado one, which has become sort of globally known now. So it's clear that there's opportunities there. Yeah, I get that it's cold, but people dive in all kinds of cold places too, right?
Yeah, sure.
So it
And
seems like
Okinawa, I should mention, there's some nice warmer spots.
well, correct. Yeah, so right when you go further south, like you get into some warmer waters, right? So yeah, I guess so moving away from that for 1 second, I had one other question, sort of maybe surrounding this concept. You've got, Fukushima, you had Minamata, Japan, you had these pollutants that went into the water, right? Mercury and Minamata, early in the 1900s, and then the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Obviously, that impacted seafood, and the health of seafood. Did that, in your experience, change the dynamic with how people consume food for at least some time, or did that historically change anything from the Minamata example?
Yeah, Minamata was way before my time, so I'm not sure if that had an effect
Sure, but
on public
maybe fit into
public
the culture
consciousness.
somehow. Yeah.
Yeah, but Fukushima, no, I don't think there was much concern about that. And in fact, the contamination levels in the seafood that were, unless they were caught very close to the site, which was controlled, were extremely low. I mean, they were above trace amounts, but they were below, like government limits and things. But that became a longstanding issue I would say because of political factors like China, just maybe South Korea as well, saying that they didn't want to import seafood from Japan. But that's just made things more available to the Japanese public. And certainly there was a lot of consumption going on in the Japanese public as a counterbalance to that.
Interesting. Yeah. So the Fukushima maybe had more bearing on the trade than it did for local consumption. And then I guess my comment too with or question with the Minamata thing, yeah, it happened well before any of our time, but that was really the big case that made a lot of that globally provided the awareness that mercury, in particular methyl mercury, was a major concern for consumption of seafood, especially top predators like sharks. So I wondered, do people in Japan is there any concern with that at all when they consume seafood, or are you not aware of people even thinking about that?
I think the awareness of that is very low, but in terms of sharks and mercury content in particular. But and I should, maybe this is a good opportunity to say that a lot of products that sharks are made from in Japan are not labeled as being from shark, and so people are very surprised to find out that a major ingredient in something called hampen, which is like a fish cake, which a very popular food in Japan. You always see it in the supermarket, and people eat it all the time, including for breakfast. Is made from shark meat. So people are just not aware of that. They're like, oh, it's hampen, it's made from fish. They don't know that it's made from shark.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the States we work around that quite a bit too, where the health and the toxin levels sort of like intersect, where it's like, how do you make that decision? And the FDA and EPA have come together to really try to like increase the mercury level, which has happened, right? Because they want to also promote the healthy aspects and the omega-3s of fish. So that's an intersecting, concept for consumption is like, yes, it's healthy, but at a certain level, it might not be it anymore.
I don't know if this is the right time to insert it, but the other thing that's really interesting about Japan that I noted is just as COVID hit, I decided to get a dog. So now I have another member of the household that I'm buying things for. And I realized as I went online to like shop for dog snacks, so many of the dog treats in Japan are made from shark. And I don't think you would see that in the US, or at least it's not labeled as such, but it's very obvious in Japan that a lot of the products are made from shark.
There are a couple papers looking at pet food or pet products in the US. And yeah, if I remember correctly, a lot of times it's not labeled, but their shark does appear in some of it. Which is one of those things, just like of all the species to choose from. The dog, I have a dog. She's a potcake from the Bahamas. She doesn't care what it is, you know? Like, let's just put some peanut butter in there. She'll be thrilled.
So yeah, maybe Americans would not want to buy something because it's shark, but that's like a prominent part of the label in Japan. So
Interesting. Yeah.
tells us.
So many differences culturally that I think like Japan was a place that when I visited, it felt like it really felt like traveling in like the greatest sense I think I've ever experienced. Like I can go to so many countries where there are so many similarities culturally, even if the language is different. Things are it doesn't feel that different, Like I'm in San Diego. I always feel like San Diego and Barcelona are kind of sister cities, like different languages, different cultures, but very similar in lots of ways. But going to Japan it does feel like you're entering a completely different world. There's not that much in terms of similarities between at least the US and Japan. So it's hard to even, I know lots of people have, I'll comment on like my own personal value system with certain things I've seen on menus in a place like Japan or elsewhere, things like whale meat and things like that. But it's not, I'm always hesitant because the cultures are so different. We're coming from such different places. I don't even know. It's difficult to know how to feel about these types of things or where to even begin talking about them in a respectful way, but still like through a scientific lens. And I'm curious if you've had any struggles with that kind of, I don't know, all of that coming together, being from the US, but in Japan and kind of matching your personal values or maybe US sort of cultural values originally to living there.
Well, I can think of two anecdotes to tell you. One is that in my postdoc, I was working for a Japanese research lab, and it's a different research lab from the one that works on the whaling industry and whale science in Japan. But they would get, when the fleet came back from the whaling operations, they would get a fresh, season's worth of meat, and we would have a whale meat eating party. So I didn't know that this was a thing, but it's an annual event, or it was at this research institute where I worked. And so they had this little loudspeaker, and I said, and now the whale meat eating party will commence in the conference room on the first floor. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I'm going to go down there. So I went down there and I put my head in there, and people were already there, and they were just like, oh my God, she's here. She's going to see us eating whale meat. So they were just like embarrassed that I was seeing them eating whale meat. But I wanted to say that I don't think whale meat is commonly eaten in Japan now. I mean, you can find it in a lot of places, but it's kind of like a nostalgic food that people eat because back in the day that the food supplies were more limited and they were fed it as part of school lunches or something. Anyway, it's kind of like a grandpa's kind of food, like a throwback kind of food. I don't think many younger people really like eating whale meat, so I don't feel that it's an integral part of the culture. So that's one thing. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that some of my friends and acquaintances know that I've worked on sharks, and so like sometimes when they come and visit me, they want to. It's a very big thing in Japanese culture to bring someone a gift if you're coming to see them. So they bring me like shark fin or shark fin. It's like, no, thank you. So they just and they try to be nice, and
Right.
I usually just accept it and then give it to someone else later. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Because being polite is also Japanese culture, right? So
yeah, not allowing your partner to lose face, your companion to lose face. So yeah,
Right.
but it goes back to what we were saying about the consciousness level of conservation issues being very low.
Yeah.
But-
Yeah. It's fascinating. There's, I think shark fins have come up a couple times, and it's something that we were hoping to chat with you about, given all the work you've done in that space. And I think I've noticed lately in particular, I think like the public is very aware of shark finning. Um, Almost too much so. Like people, it's very easy to point the finger at shark finning as the reason for sharks being in a bad way at the global level. And although that was probably the case at one time, now when you read the latest publications focused on threats to sharks, like out of the, IUCN Shark Specialist Group and like some of these foundational papers of conservation status globally, the focus and the language that's used now is really on overfishing, particularly unintentional catch or bycatch. So I was just curious if it might be helpful if you could define shark finning to begin, just so everyone's on the same page. But then just throughout your career I'd be curious as to like your perspective on the trends, from when you first started studying this to now in shark finning, the shark fin trade, demand for shark fin, in Eastern Asia in particular, and then what your thoughts are today as to like what is the threat from shark finning now relative to maybe 10 or 20 years ago, when you compare it to something like bycatch or the meat trade. That's a big question.
Yeah, how much time have we got?
We've got time.
You may have to remind me of some of the aspects of that because I'm not sure I
Just
remember to cover.
you can tell us everything you know about shark fins. That's the question.
Okay. You first asked what's the definition of finning, so perhaps we should start there.
Let's start.
Finning is where you cut the fin off the shark and throw the body away at sea. It needs to be on board a vessel because sometimes sharks are caught and the fin could be kept once it's brought to the port and the body could be thrown in the trash. Let's say the shark was not preserved well and the meat's spoiled. That's not considered finning. So a lot of people conflate finning with cutting the shark off the fin while it's still alive, but it can be finning even if the shark is killed first. I think the reason why finning was, kind of the motivation for a lot of the early conversations about shark conservation is it kind of captures all the bases. If you're concerned about, animal welfare and suffering of animals, then, finning is going to be important to you because, it's cruel. If you're concerned about wastage, it's very wasteful because it's wasting the body just for like 5% of its body weight, which is the fins. And if you're concerned about conservation in general, it's contributing to excessive mortality of sharks. So, by taking action against finning, or in some cases, governments and international organizations that control the high seas have taken action against live finning. Usually we see, so that would get the animal welfare issue off the table. But most of the time it's a regulation against finning per se. And that means that, you can't throw the shark body away and keep the fin, but you could still kill the shark and throw the whole body away. So it doesn't solve the mortality part of the problem. And I think that's kind of where we are right now. A lot of countries and RFMOs, regional fisheries management organizations, that are making the rules for the high seas fisheries have outlawed finning. And it's hard to know what the compliance levels are. I think in general, there's a lot less finning than there used to be, but we still hear these rumors that certain fisheries, especially if they don't operate with observers that can record what's happening, are finning. And certainly we see some court cases brought where, in particular, the crew who often get some of the profits from the finning are taking fins off the boat with them to go back home. That's how some of these incidents are found out about. So it still occurs. But I'm really glad to hear you say, and that not only that you think so, but that you think in the media and in society in general, that the focus has moved on. Because, I think people like you and I have been focused on the mortality from the beginning. If we don't have sharks, we lose a lot of things. We lose a resource, we lose part of the ecosystem, we lose, the existence value of sharks is important to us. So we don't want to see them fish to extinction. And if we want to prevent that from happening, then we need to control mortality and not just utilization. So yeah, you referred to some studies recently that have concluded that finning is no longer the big problem, that it's excessive mortality. Moving away from finning a little bit, one of the other very widespread measures that has been taken in fisheries management is to have a no retention policy for certain species. Usually these are species specific and only for species that are frequently caught or found to have been impacted by fishing already. But these no retention measures say that if you catch this shark, you can't keep it. You have to release it. Release it sounds like it's alive, right? I mean, basically you have to throw it over the side or cut it free from the line. But in fact, in a lot of fisheries, by the time the shark gets to the fishing boat, it's already dead or so injured that it can't survive its injuries. So I really want to emphasize that these no retention policies are not a panacea. They're not going to save all the sharks. In fact, we're not even sure in some cases if it can save most of the sharks. In fact, maybe most of the sharks are dead anyway.
Right. And so, yeah, I think in these papers that we've mentioned, it's the focus on mortality. And I think it's almost an intentional effort to not try to parse out necessarily where that mortality comes from, because that's a very difficult and almost separate question. How would you describe the relationship between finning bans and total fishing mortality? Generally, like how effective are they in your opinion?
Hard to say. I think a lot of the fisheries in Asia and fisheries that I've worked with, like the tuna fishery and the WCPFC, for some species, especially if the fishing is conducted near enough to shore that they are making many trips and they have hold space so they can land the sharks, they want to keep the bodies for these products. Like I mentioned earlier, the fish cake or hampen products, they'll take whatever fish material they can get and pound it up and mix additives with it and make it into a fish cake. So a lot of times the sharks are desirable catch. They may not be the most desirable catch. There may not be hold space for them if the catch of the target species like tuna or billfish has been good. There's not much space to keep the sharks, but they'll not want to throw the body away. So unless there's a no retention measure, they'll want to keep the whole shark. So in that case, the finning ban is not really going to change anything because they want to keep it. So in Asian fisheries, especially nearshore fisheries, I don't think finning bans have really helped. Now in the high seas fisheries where they're, weeks away from the port and the hold space is limited, yeah, I think probably finning has stopped. But, I do worry about high seas transshipment. And that's one of the things I'm working on in my current job is to try to get a better handle on transshipment, get better management control, regulatory control of what's going on. assess whether there's unauthorized transshipment. Because if you have transshipment, you can have fishing vessels keeping everything that they catch and then transshipping the sharks at sea. So the record of that catch is kind of obscured, and landing those fish wherever where there's not good control, data's not recorded. So transshipment is a big loophole for the whole regulation of finning.
And this is where a boat will catch all these animals and then just dump it onto like a freezer on another boat. And then that kind of severs the link between like where the animal was caught, how it was caught, and where it ends up.
Yes.
And that's on
And,
purpose.
yeah, well, I think so. Yeah. There's transshipment. I have to say there's transshipment for a reason, and that's because these fishing boats are operating way offshore. And if they're catching a lot of tuna, they're not going to have the hold space to keep those tuna. So those transshipment boats are out there, going around and actually resupplying crew food and fuel of these vessels, and then they're taking the catch off. So they'll take the target species like tuna off and back to the home port and land it. They'll also take sharks, and they might also be taking shark fins.
And so this really kind of allows for nonstop fishing, right? Efforts. So that they can keep going, and just have their catches offloaded. And it's interesting you're talking about the coastal fisheries for sharks too, where they're bringing them in, retaining more sharks. Do you think that the finning ban actually created more of a market for some of the shark products? I mean, that's been shown and reported in some publications like the Worm et al. 2024 paper. And so that might be one concept. And it seems like some of the reporting show that with some of the RFMO management efforts, that coastal shark populations have gone down relative to decreased mortalities offshore, even with the transshipment. So I wonder how those things all intersect.
These are very difficult issues. I certainly don't have all the answers, but to start with the point about whether finning regulations have created a market for shark meat, it may have in some cases, but I think in many cases those shark carcasses were in demand anyway, and they were probably just recorded not as shark carcasses, but as just fish landings, especially in the FAO statistics. I work for the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, and they've been publishing catch statistics for countries all around the world for many decades. But you can look at the trends in the reporting. When I first started looking at these data like 30 years ago, there was so much unreported, so much quantity of fish reported in these undifferentiated categories, just like fish or just sharks, rays, and chimeras is a category that's still used a lot. They do have species-specific categories, but if the countries aren't recording the sharks in those distinct categories, then they just get lumped into, undifferentiated fish, and that's just a huge global total. So what we see now is that more and more sharks are being recorded to the species level, but mainly it's the distinctive sharks and the common sharks like blue shark and shortfin mako. But still, about 25% of the sharks being recorded worldwide are in this sharks, rays, and chimeras undifferentiated category. So there's still a lot. And if you look at the other 75%, it's like I said, it's mostly blue shark and dogfish and shortfin mako. So I think there's still a lot of sharks being caught and landed that aren't being recorded as sharks. And I think it's a trend. So we're seeing more and more sharks being recorded as sharks. But in the past, I think that catch was still there and we just didn't see it. So that undermines our ability to say whether the finning regulations have created a market for shark carcasses or whether that market was there all along and we just didn't see it. Certainly, shark protein is, shark is a food and people need food. And in some places in the world, there are food scarcities. And so if there's shark available to supply that need, it's going to be used. South America is a big market for shark meat, certainly Africa. And like I said, in Asia, for these fish cake products, it's everywhere.
Yeah, I guess we just saw that in the news in Brazil with shark meat being fed to school kids, right? That was a huge international news story. So clearly it's happening. And you're also talking about all these things that are a big part of your career, which is the IUU, right? The illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Why do you think that continues to be such a persistent problem, even as we're expanding our knowledge of how the data gets interpreted in fisheries management?
Yeah, there's two issues there. I mean, like, we don't get good data on catches in general, so that really hampers our ability to do good science. So I would really like to see better recording of what's caught, and to the species level. But then in terms of IUU, like, absolutely illegal activities out there, I think there's less and less of that going on, because we talk about IUU and it's actually got three parts, right? Illegal is just the I, and then there's the U, which is unreported, which is really important, and unregulated is the last U. So unregulated is fisheries that are conducted outside of a management framework. And there's, as fisheries management has evolved over the years, more and more fisheries are under some form of management, even if it's, very, very small scale coastal fisheries. They still have to be licensed, or they still have to report their catches in some way, even if they say, I caught, 10 kilograms, and they don't even say what. So there's very little unregulated anymore, I think, and there's less and less illegal. But what we really need to focus on is the unreported. And what we mean when we say unreported is not reported at all, reported at a quantity that's actually less than what they caught, or reported as something that it's not. That includes reporting something as fish when it's actually, blue shark or something like that. So, um, fisheries occur, they're not happening on land. They're far away from where we have people to report what's going on. And observer coverage, observer programs, and such are a very good way to know what's going on. They can report to us on compliance with the rules and also the species composition, but it's very low. In the purse seine fishery, in many parts of the world, we have good coverage. We have, like people like to say, we have 100%. Usually it's not exactly 100%, but it's high. And then in the longline fisheries, which catch, considerably more sharks and a wider variety of species, we have very low observer coverage. We're lucky if we get 10% in most fisheries. So we like to assume that what the observers see happening in terms of catch rates of species is across the board. And we extrapolate to all the fisheries that we don't have, or all the boats that we don't have observer coverage on. But who knows, maybe the behavior of those boats is completely different if they have an observer on board. So the catch rates could be, and the mortality from the interactions could be a lot higher on the unobserved catches.
There's a WWF report a while back, and there's a line in it that's always stuck with me, and it relates to a lot of this, like, illegal trade, and not only fins but gill plates, and not necessarily, legal and illegal, and maybe all of that coming together into the same trade routes. But they have this line where they say shark and ray products move more along shipping lanes than migratory pathways. And that when I first read that, I just thought it's a crazy concept for a lot of these species that we think of as, like, moving across ocean basins. And yet still, when they become dog food, or when they get into cosmetics, or, just shark fin going to Hong Kong or something, they're moving a long ways. And all these invisible connections between essentially sources and sinks for these animals. And CITES comes into play, and it's very timely because CITES, I should define Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna. Much easier to say CITES, but it encourages sustainable management by regulating trade in about 150 species of shark and ray right now, by prohibiting trade outright, and then for others requiring an export permit and some sustainability certification, essentially from the country of origin. But in what is it, a few weeks now, or a month or two, there are going to be tens of additional shark and ray species proposed for listing, or being uplisted from one appendix to the next. And so I was curious, since you're working in this space with IUU fishing and RFMOs and everything, like how effective can a CITES Appendix 1 or 2 listing be for some of these threatened species? And just generally, what are your opinions on it? Like a lot of folks see it as a silver bullet solution, and others have a lot of criticism. So where do you fall on that spectrum for CITES? And also just any thoughts on the trade and shark and ray products generally?
Another huge question. It's hard to know where to start. CITES certainly has the potential to be a very effective measure, but as you said, it only governs those products that are traded. So, and the other thing is that it's implemented by countries around the world. So if we don't really trust countries to implement fisheries management, I feel like a lot of people put all their emphasis on CITES because they don't really think that fisheries management works. But it's the same governments that are trying to enforce the CITES regulations as are enforcing the fishing regulations. So if we don't have trust in those governments and those governments don't have good governance frameworks, then we're not going to get a good result, no matter which aspect we take. A lot of the sharks at the moment are on Appendix 2, and people tend to think of something being listed on CITES as kind of a black or white thing. Okay, it's on CITES. All right, it's all right. It's going to be okay. But those species that are on Appendix 2, and that's certainly most of the sharks right now, they can still be traded. There's no prohibition on trade. It's just that you need certain permits, and those permits, as you said, require that there be some kind of finding by the country of origin that the harvest of those species were not detrimental to its survival. So again, if you're a government that isn't really concerned about shark conservation and you're more concerned with supporting your fishermen and your traders, you're going to make a finding like that. And these findings are not necessarily made public, so we don't know what basis these governments are using for making those findings. In a lot of cases, they can submit those findings to the CITES Secretariat, and the CITES Secretariat will make them publicly available on their website, but the number of countries that do that is very limited. And then CITES has its own process for considering kind of in an internal manner whether those countries' findings were correct or not. And that's called the Review of Significant Trade. But that only occurs every few years. And as you know, there's so many different kinds of species on CITES, from elephants to birds to turtles to lizards. So there's only a few species selected each time for this Review of Significant Trade, and only a few countries for each species. So the amount of surveillance, if I can use that word, on what the countries are doing is pretty limited in the CITES framework. And coming back to what I started with about, how CITES is only regulating trade. I mean, and what we were talking about earlier with, what is causing the mortality of sharks? Is it because people want to get these products, or are they just a bycatch, or is it kind of like an accidental mortality because you're trying to catch tuna and all of this silky shark got on my line instead, and I don't care about the silky shark and I'm not allowed to keep it anyway, so I'm just gonna, gaff it and throw it overboard. If that silky shark dies in that process, that has nothing to do with CITES. And if that kind of mortality occurs frequently enough, then we're going to get a devastating impact to the silky shark population, which needs to be controlled through fisheries management. So I always come back to, okay, CITES is nice, but I really want to focus my efforts on fisheries management, because if CITES works properly, and I hope that it does, and there are a lot of people working on that, there's very few of us working on sharks and fisheries management. And I really think that we're going to come back to that eventually, because that's where that residual, that continuing mortality will be occurring. And we may need to bring that down even further. I'm pretty sure we do in most cases.
What would you like to see to solve these problems, to reduce shark mortality where it is unsustainable? Like, what are the levers that you want to pull, that you're encouraging governments to pull?
Well, a lot of the times we are as scientists are faced with the argument that, well, you don't have the data to back that up. You want us to do this, and it's going to be cumbersome for our fisheries or economically disadvantageous, but you don't have the data to back that up. It's like, that's right, because you don't give us the data that we need to have a clear conclusion on this. So, I mean, it's not a silver bullet, but it's like the foundation to having solid fisheries management is to get better data. And so I worked on this Common Oceans project for 5 years. That's where we first met, Brendan. I was working around the world, like trying to get the RFMOs to require better data to be submitted. And I had a few, tiny wins maybe, but it was a very frustrating experience. But I have to start there because it's the foundation of everything. Then I would like to see these no retention measures that we do have a lot of them, and they cover a lot of the important pelagic species. Let's see them evaluated for whether they work or not. Unfortunately, a lot of times when you have a no retention measure, you just get 0 catches recorded. And that might even be the correct data, because in a longline fishery, if they catch a shark and it's on the line, it's on the leader off the main line of the long line, they can tell as they're pulling it in from the tension on the line that it's a shark, and they'll just cut it. So they'll leave a long leader attached, which is very damaging to the shark. Often the longer leaders will cause the shark to die because it'll get tangled in it, or it'll swallow it, or the wound from the hook in the mouth. Anyway, they'll release that, and they might write it down as a shark, or they might not write it down at all. And probably they don't know what species it is. Almost certainly they don't know what species it is. So that data to us is fairly meaningless. But let's get a better handle on whether these no retention measures are actually making a difference to the total mortality. And then, really pie in the sky out there probably is I would like to see us have more regulations like they have for marine mammals in I think it's the Hawaii longline fishery. Move on measures. If you're catching, like a huge number of sharks in a certain set, or maybe you need multiple sets, then you need to move out of that area. There are hotspots. Brendan, you propose this. There are hotspots in the Pacific where there are huge numbers of sharks just being wiped out from a few days of fishing operations. If we could reduce those extreme mortality events, I think that would be really useful. But again, we need data to know where those hotspots are. And just to get an aside on another conservation strategy, marine reserves and marine protected areas. I mean, they're lines on a map, right? They work well in a terrestrial environment where, habitat's quite fixed. But in the ocean, habitat depends on sea conditions, which, especially these days with global variability, climate change, those areas are moving. So where do we draw those marine reserves and protected areas? And do we not allow fishing in those areas? I mean, we need to get a much better idea of what are the key areas for sharks and to try to reduce the fishing mortality in those areas. I would love to see people working on that more. I would love to work on that more myself. I'd like to see more electronic monitoring to kind of up our observer coverage, because we really, in the longline fishery, where many more sharks, more species are caught than in the purse seine fishery, we don't have good coverage. But if we could get cameras on board, then we would at least have some idea of, whether finning is occurring. That would be easy to see on a camera. Whether the line's being cut off and what shark is on the end of that line, but cameras are not going to tell us that. But I think silver bullet is really not the right term in this kind of conversation. There's probably no silver bullet, but anyway, a lot of little progress here and there could lead to a big gain.
Yeah. A lot of tough problems to solve. We're putting you on the spot.
We're asking you every single question there is about fisheries policy management.
Yeah.
These are big questions that we fight in every area, and we're just, talking to you about Japan, but obviously these issues occur throughout the world.
Well, thank you for bringing attention to them. It is a super challenging field, and it can be very frustrating too. coming back to CITES, I think that's why people like CITES because, we were talking about game shows earlier in the conversation too. It's like, let's get this species on the list. Yay, we did it. And there's so much work to do even within the CITES sphere after that happens. But it's just like a catharsis. You feel like you go on this campaign to get this species listed and you persuade countries and you get the vote and it's all very dramatic. And then, it's a conservation win and you should celebrate it. But we don't have those kinds of uh, dramatic events in RFMOs. It's just like a slow grind of, okay, this meeting, can we get this adopted? And I feel, in today's world, everybody has a short attention span. So, we need people that are really in it for the long haul and willing to, you know, grind it out to work in fisheries management.
For people that want to contribute some sort of effort, are there ways to do that you think are worthwhile?
Well, I think the whole sustainable seafood movement is a good thing, and I certainly try to buy fish that I know where they came from and that I know they were fished sustainably. So that's that kind of awareness and purchase power. Um, Decision making is very useful for everybody. I think moving on from, shark finning is bad, and now we've solved that, so sharks are okay, kind of thinking is important. So, like, learning about, how else shark mortality occurs and being concerned about that. Uh, we could certainly do with more attention on fisheries management than CITES. And, because we've got a lot of attention on CITES already. I'm not trying to say we shouldn't care about CITES, but, remember that these findings that countries have to make that allow a CITES permit to be issued are based on fisheries management. So, it all kind of comes back to what's happening on the water. But in terms of citizen science, one thing that I think we're really lacking at the moment is we have more and more people going out doing shark counts. So you guys would know about this, like the kind of diving experiences that you had where like they're tallying up what species they saw and how many sharks are in the water. But let's try to look at what's happening in the markets. I mean, how many shark products are we seeing in the markets and what are the trends there? We don't have much citizen science work on that aspect. And there's a research effort that I've been involved with that I hope the paper's coming out soon to talk about shark meat markets around the world. And that team was able to go to a number of key markets and do some surveys, but unfortunately it was during COVID. So the time series was limited and the number of sites was limited. But if we got more of awareness around the world of people looking for shark products in the market, we might be able to get some kind of trend signal from that work that might help us.
I often have found, and you've been in a lot more RFMO meetings than I have, so I'm really curious as to your take. If you have the right individual at the meeting that raises their hand and says something at the right time, suddenly you can get text included in a document where it wouldn't be otherwise. So there's this weird, like the power of certain individuals, I think is also, like, I'd be curious how many individuals at the RFMO level have had like a really outsized impact on global fisheries management. Can you relate to any of this? Like, have you seen this in your career of just right place, right time, one person who's funded to be there and actually be a voice in the room?
Wow, it really depends because you can have some very influential and knowledgeable people in the room, but they can't get the microphone. And I think it's almost like you need the convergence of two things. You need an effective person who's well informed, who represents a delegation that has some power in the room. And that power comes from, they are maybe holding back giving approval on something that another country wants. So it's this power play. And it all revolves around the target species and the industry lobbies behind these government representatives. So, I like to see a country like the US really standing up for issues like bycatch because the US has power to block consensus on certain things that other countries want. So you need a country with power where you have an individual who's really willing to take a stand on an issue like bycatch or sharks, and who has the knowledge and the science to back them up. So I think that's the way it works. But, even for me, who've been to, like, I don't even know, dozens of RFMO meetings, it's sometimes a mystery of, like, why things get decided. Because it's a lot of backroom dealing that you don't see go across the floor.
Interesting. Yeah, there's a paper that I really like that's come up a lot in recent years, by Melissa Cronin and her colleagues, and it
Mm.
just clarifies the disparity between like when you actually know enough to inform a decision, and yet an RFMO or regulatory body will decide to not do something and maybe cite data deficiency or something, but actually the data are there, like the right decision's on the table, but it's ignored. So there's so much more to making the right decision to support sustainable fishing than just like going out and doing some field research. Then it has to be translated. Someone has to stand up and raise their hand at the meeting and convince other individuals. Maybe it's like 25 people sitting at a table, that dictate like the fate of a shark population in the Pacific. Like it really comes down to
Yeah.
very few individuals.
But it could also be, right, because we see this at the state level here in Florida too, where it's quite clear that the decisions have been made even before the meeting takes place, right? I that was so clear to me in a number of meetings that I went to, where they just listen, and you'd think it went one way, but they'd already made the decision. It was very clear. But to the individual level at that rate, when you get to high level politics, it's a couple people that are very influential or who have been influenced, that do have that contribution to that decision. And so maybe that's partly what it is, right? It's being able to have the ear of the right person that makes those decisions that can have a very strong hold on an individual level if you're able to influence the right people. So there is something to be said there.
Well, and the other thing, just to add a third dimension there, is just the time on the agenda. Because when you get to these RFMO meetings, most of the people there just want to talk about the tuna. They don't care about anything else. Even the billfish, they don't care about. And they certainly don't care about sharks, turtles, and seabirds. And it's only because the NGOs are there that we get any time for those issues on the agenda at all. But sometimes you would need to have a debate, and you need to have that kind of power dynamic play out by, allowing the issue to brew and solutions to be proposed and compromises to be brokered, et cetera. But it just doesn't happen because there's so much pressure on making a decision about, the harvest control rule or the national allocations for tuna in the next year. This is like sharks. Yeah. Okay. We have a report from the scientific committee, adopted. Well, next, and the scientific committee doesn't make any policy decisions. It just says there was a stock assessment and it was valid. That's it.
Right.
So, it's coming back to the whole citizen, activism, but what can citizens do? Just demand that there be discussions at the RFMOs, because if the RFMOs don't take these decisions, then no one can. So they need to have time and pressure on them to actually make a decision on something related to bycatch. Just to link a couple different topics that we've been talking about, the way to get tuna managers' attention is through the industry representatives. And the industry representatives have bought into the MSC certification system. So MSC does have a lot of power. But, for example, MSC has a policy that no fishery, might not be getting this 100% right, but no fishery that allows finning can be certified. So that's their shark policy. But, they need to move on from that because, as we've been saying, there's much more to conserving sharks than just stopping finning. So I would like to see that policy evolve, because MSC does have leverage against for some of these fisheries that would influence these RFMO discussions.
And for those who don't know what that is, who are listening, that's Marine Stewardship Council, is MFC.
Yeah, the blue check. I'm curious what other part of me wants to ask your opinion on what the most effective NGO is, but I don't think we won't do that. Who's in the room? Like, if I think folks have the power to purchase products that are caught sustainably, etc. That's one way to have a direct impact on a day-to-day basis. Another is to support organizations that have the capacity to attend RFMO meetings. So what are the NGOs that you see represented most often at these meetings that are in the room that might say, hey, let's pause for 10 minutes and talk about sharks?
I would like to shout out to WWF, who's really made a huge commitment over the years to attend WCPFC meetings. I know that their key staff person, Buttle Cook, has recently left WWF, so I'm not sure if that was something that he was, successful in getting funding to do, and now that he's gone, that won't happen. But he's a particularly effective advocate for bycatch, the WCPFC, and WWF worldwide is good. ISSF is not really your typical International Seafood Sustainability Foundation. It's not your typical NGO because it's a industry sponsored body, but they do good work in bycatch as well. And Pew has, as far as maintaining a strong commitment and a presence at the meetings, the Pew has been a longstanding partner. They tend to have their own agenda and initiatives, but sometimes that aligns with science-based bycatch mitigation.
I think that's really helpful. I think a lot of people are looking for ways to be a part of the solution to problems facing sharks, and I often don't know where the solutions lie, and I work in this space all the time. Yeah, I think, like you said earlier, lots of solutions come in the form of tiny little baby steps forward, and you might not see. I was actually encouraged. I think I kind of poo-pooed some of my own work in a previous podcast we did, looking at discard mortality of deep sea sharks. And funny enough, this past week, somebody sent around the latest CITES reports for the species that are proposed for uplisting, and gulper sharks are in there. And I was perusing the gulper shark CITES report from the internal body, and our paper on discard mortality of gulper sharks was cited. And it was the first time where I was like, my God, we did this work 10 years ago. This whole time I've thought to myself, yeah, it's cool, but it's done nothing. But then suddenly it makes it as a one-liner in the CITES report, and it's not the same species as what's most often traded and whatever else. There's all these little, nuances to it, but it's a piece of useful information that can guide responsible decision-making. That's kind of the best we can do in science.
Well, congratulations. That's so rewarding
Thank
when
you.
you see that happen. And
It was a
I've
cool moment.
had little things like that too. And I always realized that my time horizon for something to happen as a result of something I've proposed is too short. You need to double it or triple it, because eventually some of these things do happen. But by the time it happens, I had given up. I'd still put the information out there, but I'd given up on anybody ever paying attention to it. But it does happen, but it takes a long time.
Yeah, it does. And I'll say your work on silky sharks, I have leaned on very heavily over the
thank you.
years. Yeah, and I love, it's always fun to meet other scientists who laid the groundwork for something that you end up focusing on for years that become a major piece of life, and silkies have been that for me. And I feel lots of the work you've done in the Pacific, and Melanie Hutchinson as well in the Pacific, have been the guiding lights for me scientifically,
Yeah.
looking at silky.
Well, thank you so much for carrying it forward.
We're doing our
It's so
best,
awesome. Yeah, it's awesome when, as scientists, we always talk about standing on the shoulders of giants. So I guess that's in some ways, Shelley, you're a giant in that field, and you've contributed some great work. And I think speaking to the effort that it takes to make some change, obviously it doesn't happen overnight, and a lot of, I think, people, especially maybe the younger generation, really wants to see things happen overnight, right, from one effort. But there's an exhaustion level with that we all have to endure as scientists, as citizens, that you need to keep putting that pressure on. If we let up, then change doesn't happen. And sometimes it can take, like we said, a generation. You hope it doesn't take that long, but progress is slow. and we have to keep on, and you have to keep up hope, as Jane Goodall always said, right? So, I guess that's the message overall in the science community and for everyday citizens.
And we don't do it because we're trying to accumulate wins or because we need to, s- we want to see something happen, but we don't do it because we're going to get something to happen. We don't know whether it's going to happen or not. We do it because we want to be on the right side of the issue and we need to try.
We have to do the right thing and it's important to do that. Yeah, you're right. We don't know what the end result will be. But if the work is important as it is for all of us, then that's why we put so much effort and energy behind it. And as it takes, you know.
Yeah, just do the best job you can. What so something that I think Chris and I both struggled with over the years is trying to do research that will eventually be useful in this type of context. And it's really helpful to hear from folks in like very much in the policy space of what the research needs are, like really not in writing a grant application saying this is conservation relevant, blah, 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 but like truly what
Everybody says that it is conservation relevant,
Right.
but and sometimes I look at that and I'm like, really? How?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people don't know. And so one question we have for you is if someone is listening to this who is about to start graduate school and their main interest is supporting shark conservation, in areas where it's needed most, let's say in the Pacific, what would you encourage them to do to have that impact? Like big picture, but also like even if specific projects come to mind, what would your advice be for them?
Well, I feel like fisheries is seen as like some kind of dirty industry and like we don't like fisheries because they don't listen to us and they kill the animal that we're working on, which is true, but that's fine. We need to engage with them. So I would just advise someone to consider like what is the fisheries angle or like how does your research interact with or potentially affect fisheries or how does fisheries affect what you're doing? There's probably some angle there because fisheries is such a structuring factor in the ocean environment these days. No area is immune from fishing pressure. So don't think of it as something to be avoided and that we need to build this wall around our species or community of interest, marine community of interest, and keep fisheries out. I mean, fisheries is always going to be there. So how can you do something with fisheries or that would make a suggestion for better fisheries management?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Shelley, for sharing your expertise. I think this was a tough one for us to round out the series for a variety of reasons, and so it's just really nice to come back and get 6 out of 6. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's been my pleasure to talk to you, and I really want to thank you for being on the All the Sharks show in the first place, bringing more attention to sharks. But in the context of this interview, like which might seem very dry to some of your viewers, to kind of turn the spotlight over to fisheries management because I think that's really where it's at in terms of saving sharks. If we ignore fisheries management, we're not going to be able to reach our goal of having, sustainable shark fishing and maintain the shark populations and ecosystems into the future. So thanks to everybody for listening about that topic.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. And those are all the points that we wanted to make with you, and you did an incredible job answering a lot of very complex questions. So thank you. And to learn more about Shelley's work, you can visit sasamaconsulting.com or explore her publications on Google Scholar, which is where we like to go. We'll also provide links to the resources referenced in this conversation below the video.
Great. Well, thank you for joining our podcast series, Beyond All the Sharks. We've learned a whole lot from fellow shark docs in every location that we visited while filming Netflix's All the Sharks. And hopefully you've learned something too. If you like this video or series, please give it a like or share it with a friend. We're going to put an indefinite pause on this effort for now, unfortunately, because although it's been very rewarding, it does take a lot of time and we need to get back to our real jobs. I'm sure our employers will be happy about that. But hopefully we see you on new projects in the future. We have lots of exciting plans that we'll share someday soon. And In the meantime, you can follow us on social media at shark_docs or connect through our website, sharkdocs.org. So thanks very much.